Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be thinking about functional skills, English, and specifically we're going to be looking at how to build and develop our vocabulary. Now this is going to help you in speaking and listening, in reading, and also in writing, so it's really important that we have a good look at these key elements as well. If you haven't done so already, please could you like and subscribe. It really does help us out when you do so. What we're going to think about at the moment is to understand the power of words and how they're used to imply viewpoints and perspectives. Now, if you think about those key words there, viewpoints and perspectives, what we mean is someone's point of view on a certain theme or topic, and their perspective is seeing it from their side of the argument. Now, this is going to be important not just in functional skills, but also if you're thinking about progressing and going on to study GCSE English as well. I'd like you to try and stretch and challenge now and think about what kind of words or phrases would you use to describe how the person feels in this image. So as we can see there, there's the little Bitmoji person there in the car, and they've got beep and honk and a lot of traffic there that's all hemmed in around them. So think about the kind of words that you'd use to describe this, because a lot of us have experienced this kind of situation. Traffic is a real thing that a lot of us have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, especially if we have to commute to go to work. So think about the kind of words that we could use to describe that picture. If you want a bit more time, then feel free to pause the video now. We're going to jump ahead now and we're going to progress with the next part of the lesson. So what we're going to think about specifically is this term word class. So the reason why we're looking at that today is because a lot of people are a little bit unsure about what we mean when we actually say word class. So we're going to look at what that is and actually think about why is it important and why do you need to know it in terms of studying English. So the first thing then, word class is a system of ordering words into specific groups depending on their function within a sentence. These are extremely important because word class is important because it allows us to understand how the word applies to the situation that it is being used in. To analyze a word, you need to know what word class it falls into. Now if we think about that word, it's quite an important word before we move on, the word analyze. What we mean by this is we mean to actually make a judgment on something, to actually break it down, and to actually understand the true intent or the true meaning behind it. And this is going to be something that you have to do quite often at the higher level, level 2 functional skills questions, especially the ones that are going to be a lot more high value as well. So having a really good idea about word class and what word class means is really integral in terms of passing the higher order questions. So there are four main types of word class, and we're going to go through them all now. Okay, so if you're not too sure what we mean by word class, don't worry about it. This is the whole thing that we're thinking about today, just understanding what word class means and how we can actually apply it to things like our reading, our writing, and also speaking and listening as well. So first thing, the most common one potentially is verbs. Now these are words that describe an action. So it might be something like to run, walk, laugh, anything really where someone's carrying something out. So anytime it's an action, it should be a verb. The next one is an adverb. And the reason why I've used these two together is because verbs and adverbs, they're often seen in close connection or close conjunction to each other. So adverbs, these are words that tell us how an action is being carried out. And these normally end in ly. So if we think about running, you could say he ran, which still would be a verb. You could say he ran quickly. So ran would be the verb and quickly would be the adverb because it tells us in the manner of which they're carrying out the actual action. Okay. The next one is a noun. So this one can be quite tricky because it does apply to many different things. So nouns are words that refer to a person, a place, object, or a business. So for example, Birmingham is a noun, David is a noun, but so are things like Netflix, which is obviously a business, and also table. So nouns do cover a lot of different things in there as well. And if we want to get really in depth about nouns, there are different types of nouns as well, but we'll save that for another video. Adjectives. So these are words that are used to describe a noun, so things like scary, tasty, and enjoyable. So anytime we're using a descriptive word, this would be an adjective, and this is also really important when you think about the description that you're giving to your audience. So when we're thinking about our writing question, we need to think carefully about the kind of adjectives we're using to make sure we're creating the best kind of impact on our reader to get the message across that we're trying to convey. So hopefully you feel a little bit better about those ones. Now what we're going to do is we're going to try and think about actually seeing these in a real life example. Look at the sentences below and identify where the writer has used a verb, an adverb, a noun, and an adjective. So if we look through the example, then we're going to see if we can identify where the specific word classes have been used. Don't worry if you're not able to identify all of them, because it is quite a large passage, but it should just help you to start thinking a bit more about the kind of words that are used and the kind of message that is being conveyed in this extract. So it says then, to me, driving is just a nightmare. I hate having to drive into Birmingham more than anything. Traffic moves so slowly it drives me mad. Surely there's a simple solution to this awful situation. Again, if you'd like to pause the video here and go through it at your own leisure, please feel free to do so. We're now going to jump ahead and we're going to start breaking down this section of text, and we're going to start identifying where the verbs, nouns, adjectives and adverbs have been used by the writer. Class feedback. Check your answers against the ones below. So here we have the same passage that we looked at a moment ago. So to me, driving is just a nightmare. I hate having to drive it into Birmingham more than anything. Traffic moves so slowly, it drives me mad. Surely there is a simple solution to this awful situation. So first thing we'd identify is me. Now me is a type of a noun. Specifically we call it a pronoun. So a pronoun is when you're talking about an actual individual. So me, she, her, them. Again, quite an interesting thing to think about these days, because people actually can choose their own pronouns depending on how they choose to identify themselves. The next one would be driving. Again, this one would be a verb, because driving, it's a physical thing we're doing, therefore it's an action, which would therefore make it a verb. A nightmare. So this can be quite difficult. So nightmare is actually describing the driving. Okay, so because it's describing the driving, it would be an adjective. Okay, so it is just a nightmare. The act of driving is a nightmare. I hate having to drive into Birmingham. So drive again is a verb, and we have Birmingham, which is a noun because it's a name of a city. The next one is traffic, and that would be a noun. Moves, again moving is talking about an action, so therefore it would be a verb. Slowly ends in an ly, and it describes how we're moving, so it would therefore be an adverb. Drives again would be another verb. Simple would be an adjective, so a solution in that case would be a noun, and these two tend to go together. So because I know that solution is a noun, simple is a word that describes the noun, so therefore it must be an adjective. So it might be that you've identified a few more on there that I haven't already picked up on, and that's absolutely fine, but just make sure that you're comfortable with how we talk about them as well. So surely there's a simple solution to this awful situation, and we know awful is also an adjective as well. Okay, so if you need to go over it, if you've got any questions, please feel free to drop us a comment on this video, and we'll try and get back to you as soon as we can. And we've got solution there, it's a noun. So try and remember them, that not every word that ends in an ly is an adverb. Okay, so for example, surely, it wasn't actually an adverb, even though it does end in an ly, it wouldn't be an adverb because it's not describing how a verb is carried out. Okay, so that's just a little thing to bear in mind when you're thinking about word class. Now that we've gained a reasonable idea of what we mean by word class, we're going to look at how this applies to your reading assessment. So when will you be asked about word class? So there's specific kind of questions that come up, and this is true for level 1 and for level 2 functional skills, and it'll be things like this. So look at the examples below and replace the underlined words with an appropriate adjective. So as we covered previously in this video, we know that an adjective is a word that describes a noun, so therefore it will be a describing word. So if we look at the first example then, the traffic in the morning is awful. Now, because the adjective awful has been underlined, what you need to do now is think about a synonym, which is a word that has a similar meaning to the word awful there, and you'd have to try and replace it. And the key to knowing if it actually works in that situation is if you read it through again and it still has the same message that is trying to be conveyed. So for number one, the traffic in the morning is awful. Number two, getting out on the open road feels great. I love driving on clear roads. So can you see there that the underlined word is great, so therefore we'd have to think about an appropriate adjective to use instead of this word. Number three, my favourite takeaway has to be pizza. It always tastes really nice. So out of the three words that we need to think about in terms of the adjectives that need to be changed or upgraded are the words awful, great, and nice. Now think carefully about the sentences for each one and make sure that the adjective that you're replacing it with actually works with the context or the situation that we're talking about. And you can see there from the teacher's top tip at the top of the screen, remember that the right adjective depends on the context of the writing. And what we mean about that is that even though nice and delicious might be similar adjectives, it really depends on what you're describing. So delicious would be something that's appropriate if you're talking about food, but if you're talking about, let's say, a beautiful landscape or beautiful scenery, you probably wouldn't use the word delicious to describe it. So think very carefully about the kind of adjectives that you're using. We're now going to jump ahead and we're going to go through the kind of answers you could have used for this response. Class feedback. Check your answers against the ones below. So answers may include but are not limited to. I'll always include this on the kind of questions where you could have multiple correct answers. So even if you don't have the exact answer that I've came up with on the screen, as long as the adjective that you've chosen actually works in the situation, then you're still getting a mark for the response. So the first one, the traffic in the morning is, and I've said it could be horrible, terrible, or atrocious. Now those are just a few that I've came up with. Again, if you've came up with different ones, that's fine. Just make sure it works in the sentence. Number two, getting out on the open road feels amazing, freeing, or spectacular. I love driving on clear roads. Number three, the last one, my favourite takeaway has to be pizza. It always tastes wonderful, amazing, or spectacular. So check what answers that you came up with yourself. Again, if you came up with anything different, don't worry about it. Just double check and see if it works in the situation. It all comes down to the context for the appropriate adjective. Writing task. Look at the writing question below and attempt the challenges that follow. Your friend has recently passed their driving test. Write an email to them to advise them on driving and road safety. In your response, you should include how to stay safe while driving, how to manage incidents and road rage, and any other advice you may think that is important. Now, within this exam, it's really important that you break down the question. Really think about what it is they want you to focus on. So the first thing to think about here would be to identify the TAP of the exam question. And what we mean by that is the topic, the audience, and the purpose. Now, we can do that together. The first thing is the topic. So the topic needs to be broken down a little bit. So your friend has recently passed their driving test. Write an email to them to advise them on driving and road safety. So the main area that we need to focus on is driving and road safety. And this actually gives us quite a few things to talk about when you think about it, because they're two kind of opposite things. Road safety can be things just like we're looking out for pedestrians, making sure that you're using things like fog lights and things like that. And driving in general could be about the condition you get yourself in, being responsible and other things like that. So it's quite a broad spectrum of things that we could talk about for this question. The next thing to think about is the audience. Now, this is going to be really important because if we're writing an email, then we know that it's either going to have to be formal or informal, but that depends on who the audience is. Okay, so it says there very clearly at the start, your friend. Now, if we're talking to our friend, we can use slang, we can talk informally, and also use colloquial language. Okay, so you don't have to use all formal language, which you would be expected to do should you be writing an email to, let's say, a government official or someone that you might work with or something like that. And the final one is the purpose. Now, the purpose is a bit of a tricky one because a lot of the time people overlook it, but it says here very clearly we are to advise. Now, when you give someone advice, you have to be careful about the kind of tone you use in your writing. You've got to think about the kind of um, adjectives you're using and make sure that you don't come off as being too offensive. In order to get someone to listen to advice, you need to make sure that you are coming at them with a nice, approachable, friendly tone, and that's the best way to get through to someone, generally speaking. Next thing, super challenge. How do you write an email? What kind of language should you use? So again, really this does come down to whether we're talking about writing an email to a friend, a relative, or someone in a more formal setting, such as a potential employer. So all of that could be learnt from just reading the question carefully. And the final thing, plan your response to the question. What will you need to do to include a high level response? It's no good just thinking I'm going to have a go and have a crack and hopefully I'll get a pass. You need to show some kind of awareness of the things that the examiner's looking for, and that's just going to help you to know the kind of things to include to get yourself a decent mark. Another thing to think about is the bullet points that have been used on the left hand side here. Now, something that's quite annoying about the way that these questions are phrased is that it says you should include. Now, whenever it says that you should do something, it means that really you have to do it. These are the things that they expect you to talk about, okay? So each one of these things within the bullet points are things that I would be considering when writing my response. So always look at those, don't just overlook them. A lot of people do when it comes to an assessment, and make sure you're using those to help formulate and plan your response. Class feedback. Check your answers against the ones below. So as we said before then, the TAP of the question is driving and road safety. That's the topic. The audience is a friend and the purpose is to advise. So for writing an email, what kind of language should we be using? So informal language if you know the person, formal language if you don't know the person personally. Final one, what do you need to do to achieve a high level response? So we need to write in full sentences. That should be something you do in every kind of facet of your writing. Write in paragraphs. Check your spelling, grammar and punctuation. And finally, use a range of De Forest techniques. If you're not too sure what we mean by that, then don't worry about it too much because we're going to go through it in the next part of the video now. So look at the acronym below and work out the language techniques that each letter represents. So here's an acronym. The one that we use to actually help plan our best ways of writing. So sometimes this changes from teacher to teacher as well. Some teacher says A forest or Da forest or even Rap forest I've heard before, but essentially it all boils down to the same kind of techniques. So for this acronym, each letter stands for a key language technique that we're going to want to use in our persuasive writing. Now we're going to have a look at a few clues that are going to help us to figure out what these might stand for. So for the first one then, clue 1, this is a question that doesn't require a verbal response. So have a think and try and consider what kind of language technique we might be referring to there. Clue 2, having 3 words or phrases to support one point. And the final clue, clue 3, using a statement that is true and can be proven to be true. So each one of those links to one of the De Forest techniques. Each of them goes to one of them. Okay, so have a quick think. If you want to pause now and try and test your understanding, please feel free to do so. We're now going to go through every single one of these language techniques. Class feedback. Check your answers against the teachers. So here we have our De Forest techniques. So the first one is direct address. Now this is one that's going to be very important because it is singling someone out. Now if you're doing, let's say, like a speech or an email or something like that, a lot of the times the techniques can be multi-purpose, and for direct address you're speaking directly to the person. So it's where you use words like you. So if you're doing a speech, for example, you wouldn't be expected to talk to one person individual, but it helps them to draw them in. And when you're doing your letter or your email, it helps you to form a bit of a connection with who you're talking to. So direct address is a good one. Some other teachers might have something different for the D. For example, they might use discourse markers, which is still a very good thing to use as well. Next one is alliteration. So this is where we repeat the same letter 2 or more times in close conjunction with each other. And this just helps to reinforce a point and say it with a little bit more emphasis, or for it to seem a little bit more important when someone's reading it. The next one is a fact. Now, a fact is just something that can be proven to be true. An opinion is kind of the opposite of a fact, really. An opinion is when you're trying to vocalize your point of view. It's not necessarily based on a fact. The R is rhetorical question. This is a question that we don't expect an actual verbal response from the audience. We're just trying to get them to think about the point that we're trying to get across. Next one is repetition. Now, repetition is probably one of the best techniques to use if you know how to use it properly. For example, everyone knows the Martin Luther King speech because of that one line, "I have a dream." And the speech is actually fairly long. The thing that actually makes us remember it quite well is that repetition of that phrase. So he says that every single paragraph, and that repetition helps drive home the central message he was trying to get across. E is emotive language. This one can be quite tricky. When we're talking about emotive language, we're talking about words that invoke an emotional response from the reader. So it's not necessarily just saying that you love or you hate something, it's saying things like, do not neglect the safety procedures when you're going to work, or something like that. And words like neglect are quite steeped in emotional reaction from the reader. Okay, so it's about words that give us an emotional response. The next one is statistics. This is one of the few times that we use maths in English. So this is where you use a fraction, a percentage, or a decimal to try and prove a point. It's basically a fact, but a fact with numbers. And the final one is a triplet, also known as a group of three. This is where we're given 3 ideas or 3 phrases towards one common goal. So for example, you might say, I really enjoy English because it's amazing, fun, and fills me with joy, or something like that. That would be a typical triplet you could use. I like to think about stretch and challenge yourself here and think about what other techniques can you remember. These are just really good ones, solid ones to think about to include in your writing, but there are quite a vast amount of different language techniques, and certainly you're going to need to know a few more when you progress and go on to GCSE as well. So if there's any more you can remember, please do try and think about them and try and make a note of them, because it's really important that we go over these techniques and use as many of them as possible in your response. Look at the student response and attempt the challenges that follow. So this is what one learner has wrote in response to the same task that we went through. So we have the task on the left hand side that we just went through. So you have it there for reference if you want to. Now this is what the student has wrote. So it said, "Hi Dan, I hope you are well, mate. Firstly, can I just say how happy I am that you have passed your test. That's really good, mate, but you need to make sure you are being careful. The roads can be really bad, so you need to be careful. There are lots of bad accidents that happen, like a lot. There are loads of people who get mad while driving, but you've got to keep your cool." So what I'd like you to think about before we move on and we look at the actual teacher's comments, I want you to think, how could this response be improved? First of all, I would say it's quite short, but other than that, what else about the actual technical accuracy, about the techniques, about the kind of words that have been used, would you think might be needed to be improved in order to help it to get a pass? So if you want to pause it and go through it, please feel free to do so. We're now going to jump ahead and we're going to go through the feedback given by the teacher. So class feedback, check your answers against the teacher's comments. So here we have the same response on the left hand side, and this is what the teacher said when it got marked. So first thing was, the candidate has wrote in the appropriate form for an email. The response has used colloquial language, so colloquial language is a good thing to know, and that is talking about slang. So the kind of thing we'd use in informal language, and that comes when you're saying hi, because hi is actually short for hello, and that would make it colloquial or slang. And we also are using words like mate. We're also using things like words with an apostrophe, which a lot of the time their function is to miss out or omit a letter from the word. So you can see that at the bottom there with the word you've. Next thing they've said, the response has been written clearly and concisely. Now this is something that we don't really talk about that often, but are you just making sure that what you're saying actually makes sense? Have you calmly and clearly expressed what you want to express? Because sometimes, especially when we're in an assessment situation, people do rush through it and they kind of get a little bit jumbled up with their ideas. So it's important to keep the cool and to keep making sure that you're really getting down what you want to get down, and then it actually makes that transition from your head onto the page, because it doesn't always happen like that. The next thing that the teacher has said then is that the response needs to use some De Forest techniques. So it hasn't used any of the techniques, or at least hasn't used them in any meaningful sense to actually help it get another mark. So if you do want to actually use this response and use it as a starting point to respond to the question, please feel free to do so. It would be important to use some of the ideas and see if you can improve them to make them a bit more engaging. The candidate needs to upgrade the adjectives and make the writing more impactful. So a thing to think about is, what are they really saying with the words? For example, can I just say how happy I am? So happy isn't really a bad adjective to use, but you could give a bit more enthusiasm with it, right? You could talk about it and say, I'm overjoyed, I'm ecstatic, I'm really, really pleased, right? Something like that to just kind of really let them know that you are there for them, you're supporting them, you really have their back, and you're really going to be fighting in their corner, right? That's really good, mate. Good isn't the best adjective either. Okay? Amazing, wonderful, brilliant. Anything like that would have been a better adjective. The roads can be really bad. Again, we want to avoid just basic, obvious adjectives. Good, bad, happy. These are all very juvenile words that we need to think about upgrading. There are a lot of bad accidents. Again, bad is used again. There are loads of people who get mad while driving, but you've got to keep your cool, right? That's absolutely fine by what they've said there, but we could have went a little bit further, right? People get mad, angry, and infuriated at terrible traffic. However, we have to keep our cool. Just by saying mad doesn't make us think that this person is relating to this situation very much, right? Everyone that has driven a car has experienced some horrible things, right? In terms of traffic, road rage, or anything like that. So you need to show the person that you've been in their shoes, that you've experienced what they're going to experience as a new driver on roads that, if we're honest, are going to be quite scary and quite intimidating. They certainly are when you first pass your test and start driving. So those are all the kind of things that you need to think about. There might be a few more things we can do to improve it. Again, it's always important to try and have a go at your own response and see how well you can actually upgrade this, and how different can you make this response look now that you've thought about all the things we've talked about within this actual video. Now we're going to think about actually applying what we've learned to a writing task. So we're going to use the challenges to write a successful response to the exam question. So the first thing to think about is write your response using 200 to 250 words. Now this doesn't mean that you need to go through and count every single word that you've wrote. You should just have a kind of idea of how much 200 or 250 words look like. We're talking about just over half a page, maybe a little bit more. You want to make sure you're giving enough kind of effort and writing enough to actually make sure that you're going to get a decent mark. The super challenge: use a range of De Forest techniques. When we say a range, we mean something like 5 or 6 techniques within your response to make sure that you're going to get a high mark. A good thing to remember with this one is that it doesn't really help if you're using the same techniques over and over again, because then you're demonstrating to the examiner that you already know how to use that technique. So they're not really going to award you additional marks if you constantly use the same technique over and over again. So try and use a few different ones. If you've used it 2 times, then it's a good idea to think about swapping it up and trying to use a different technique. Mega challenge. Read and review your work. Right, I can't stress enough how important this is, because a lot of the time we complete a bit of writing and it just gets put away, right? And we don't come back, we don't review it, and then we've got no real way of tracking or monitoring how successful we're being in our writing. So you need to read and review your work, highlight the adjectives that you've used, and make sure they're the best words for the context of the situation. And again, if you want to use that response that we looked at a moment ago, please feel free to do so. Just try and think about specifically the super challenge and the mega challenge, and how can you turn that response, which wasn't fantastic, into something a lot more meaningful and a lot more successful for your assessment. If you need any additional support or help, then new videos will be added every single week. Alternatively, leave us a comment and we'll try and get back to you as soon as possible. If you can't find anything on our channel, then please do check out our partner channel, Bookworm Teaching, for more lessons and guidance on all things English. Thanks ever so much for listening, guys, and all the best for your work and revision in the future. Thanks, bye bye.